Okay, let's dive into the story of Russia's last emperor, Nicholas II. His life and his really tragic death marked the violent end of a dynasty that had ruled for over 300 years. And we're actually going to start this story at the very end. Picture this, a damp cellar in a city called Yekaterinburg. The Tsar, his wife, their 5 children, and a few loyal servants are all down there, and they're brutally murdered. I mean, this was an act that sent absolute shockwaves across the globe and basically sealed the fate of Imperial Russia. So the big question is, how did it come to this? Right? How does one of the most powerful empires on Earth just collapse so completely that its rulers end up in a provincial basement facing a firing squad? Well, to understand that, we have to go back and really look at the man himself. The thing about Nicholas is he was just not cut out for the job he inherited. Even his own father, the powerhouse Alexander III, thought he was too much of a lightweight to rule. And, well, he was right. Now, Nicholas was a great husband and a loving father, but he was completely unprepared to rule a massive, complicated empire that was teetering on the edge of enormous change. In one of his very first public speeches as Tsar, he basically laid all his cards on the table. He called any talk about reform senseless streams and pretty much swore to rule with the same iron fist his father had. And you have to understand, for Nicholas, this wasn't just a political choice. He saw it as a sacred duty. So, this principle he was defending, it was autocracy. Nicholas genuinely believed that God had handpicked him to rule Russia. This meant he was only answerable to God, period. So, in his mind, anyone trying to limit his power with something like a constitution wasn't just disagreeing with him. They were betraying God's trust. And right here, this is the central conflict of his entire reign. On one side, you've got Nicholas, desperately trying to cling to the past. And on the other, you have Russia itself, a country just exploding with new industries and social change. You know, this clash between his medieval way of thinking and the reality of the 20th century, it was just a recipe for disaster. From the absolute beginning, his rule was just plagued by one disaster after another. Seriously, it's like fate itself was trying to send a signal that this was not going to end well. So, what's with this number? Well, it represents a horrible omen right at the start of his reign. It's the number of people who were crushed to death in a stampede at his own coronation party, the Kodinka tragedy. A rumor went around that the free gifts were running out, and the crowd panicked. And what did Nicholas do? That very same night, he went to a fancy ball at the French embassy. This one act made him seem completely out of touch, just totally indifferent to his people's suffering. It was an image he could never, ever shake. And you know, the crises just kept piling up. After that coronation disaster, Russia suffered a shocking military defeat to Japan, which completely shattered the myth of Russian power. Then came Bloody Sunday, when his troops fired on peaceful workers who were just trying to give him a petition. Each event was like another hammer blow to the monarchy. You see, before Bloody Sunday, a lot of ordinary Russians still saw the Tsar as a kind of little father, a protector who is maybe just being misled by bad advisors. But after his soldiers gunned down hundreds of men, women, and children in the streets, that sacred bond, it wasn't just broken, it was shattered. The people now saw him as their enemy. So if the first decade of his rule just cracked the empire's foundations, the next 10 years would bring the whole thing crashing down. And it really boils down to 2 fatal forces: a mysterious mystic who got way too much power in the palace, and the absolute inferno of World War I. Now, the key to understanding this next part is the family's biggest, most closely guarded secret. Their only son and the heir to the throne, Alexei, had hemophilia. This was the so-called royal disease, and it meant that any little scrape or fall could kill him. The future of the entire 300-year-old dynasty was literally hanging by a thread. And this desperation is what opened the door for Grigory Rasputin. When all the doctors failed, the Empress Alexandra turned to this holy man from Siberia. And almost miraculously, whenever Rasputin prayed, Alexei's bleeding seemed to stop. Now, historians think his calming presence might have just lowered the boy's blood pressure, but to Alexandra, this was a miracle, a literal sign from God. She became convinced he was sent to save her son, and that gave him this immense and alternately disastrous influence. So then, in the middle of World War I, with Russia taking staggering losses, Nicholas makes what might be his worst decision ever. He fires his experienced generals and decides to take personal command of the military himself, heading right to the front lines. And this was a terrible idea for two huge reasons. First, by going to the front, every single military defeat now became his personal failure. And second, he left the government back home in the hands of his German-born wife, Alexandra, who the public already deeply distrusted, and her top advisor, Rasputin. The government just fell into chaos, with ministers being hired and fired based on whatever Rasputin wanted. And while all this chaos and scandal was happening back home, this was the cost of the war. An estimated 1.7 million Russian soldiers were killed. Millions more were wounded. The country was bleeding out. There were food shortages everywhere, and the people had lost all faith in their leaders. The final collapse, when it came, happened incredibly fast. By 1917, the empire was basically a hollowed-out shell, just waiting for the slightest push to crumble. It's amazing how quickly it all fell apart. It started with women in the streets of the capital, just demanding bread in the freezing cold. Nicholas ordered his troops to fire on them, but they refused. Instead, the soldiers joined the revolution. Within days, the Tsar had no army, no government, no options. He abdicated the throne, and just like that, 3 centuries of Romanov rule was over. The family's final journey was just this slow descent into darkness. First, they were under house arrest in their own palace. Then they were exiled to the remote Siberian town of Tobolsk. And finally, they were moved to Yekaterinburg, imprisoned in a place called the House of Special Purpose, under the thumb of the hardcore Bolsheviks who would decide their fate. And that's where our story comes full circle. In that basement, the family was woken up and told they were being moved again for their safety, but instead, a death sentence was read aloud, and a firing squad opened fire. The end wasn't some grand, epic battle. It was just a squalid, secret execution. So after all that, how are we supposed to remember Nicholas II? His legacy today is just as conflicted as his reign was chaotic. I mean, you've got these two completely opposite views. On one side, there's Nicholas the Bloody. That's the name his enemies gave him, and it's the views Soviet historians pushed for decades. A weak, incompetent ruler whose stubbornness caused war and revolution. But on the other hand, the Russian Orthodox Church sees him as Saint Nicholas the Passion Bearer. They've made him and his family saints, honoring them as martyrs who face death with Christian humility. And at the end of the day, the whole debate really comes down to this. Was Nicholas a good man in an impossible situation, just swept away by historical forces he couldn't control? Or was his downfall a direct result of his own choices, his own flaws, and his stubborn refusal to change? That's the question that makes the story of Russia's last Tsar so haunting and so fascinating, even today.